Are you sure that the city you live in is real? Watch to the end and you will be shocked by the possible history of your city, using Chicago as an example. Today, I will tell you a very strange and interesting story
About the most mysterious and mystical event of the 19th century.
I'll tell you about the 1893 Columbian Exposition that took place in Chicago. At first glance, there was nothing unusual in this exhibition. Just an exhibition of achievements of the national economy, something very similar to the Paris exhibition. But it's only at first glance. If you dig deeper, this exhibition raises a lot of global questions. Let's get started.
1892 marked 400 years since Columbus discovered America. The American government decided to celebrate this day on a giant scale.
Many American cities wanted to be the center of this event, but the right to host this event won Chicago. In 1890, a wetland was chosen for the exhibition, and here we begin to have interesting moments. Construction of the Chicago World's Fair. In 1890, Chicago won the right to host the exhibition, which means all the construction work
Couldn't have started before 1890.
and that's on swamp since 1890. January 5th, 1893, 200 new structures were built. Canals and lagoons were dug. The total exhibition area is 240 hectares. It seems to be no surprise that they built 200 new buildings in a little less than 3 years.
But just look what was built. Almost a new city was built with channels, fountains, many buildings, and in the ancient style.
These are the people in the photo who designed and supervised the construction. Columbian World Exhibition.
For 6 months of the fair, it was visited by 27 million people.
The cost of a ticket to the exhibition was 50 cents. The exhibition cost $28 million. That at the current rate is $738 million.
Profit from the fair was $29 million.
At this rate, $764 million.
Overall grand fair. Let's see the most interesting objects. Electric elevated railway. Its length was about 6 miles.
Construction of the road cost $1 million. Another one interesting object. This is a Yerkes telescope, located manufacturing building. The length of the telescope is about 65 feet and the weight is 70 tons. The telescope was so precisely balanced that could have been moved by pressing your forefinger. It was the largest telescope of that time and it was specially made for the World Exhibition. The next structure is a large pole. Its length is 1,300 and width 330 feet.
Here's another one awesome structure, Ferry's Wheel.
The wheel was designed and built by George Washington Gale Ferries Jr. The height of the wheel is 262 feet. It was the highest attraction of the Columbian exhibition. The wheel rotated on 70 tons of axle. 36 cabins were fixed on the wheel. Each could accommodate 60 people.
This is just a giant structure for the late 19th century. And the most interesting thing is that it was designed and built in just 2 years.
The exhibition closed in 1893. The wheel still worked until April 1894.
Then it was dismantled and reassembled a year later in another area of Chicago, near Lincoln Park.
At this place, the wheel worked until 1905. Then the wheel was dismantled and transported to St. Louis for the next World Exhibition, where after the end of the exhibition, the wheel was not disassembled but destroyed by a controlled explosion using dynamite. The fact that they destroyed such a huge wheel seems very strange to me. Indeed, very strange. The next interesting exhibit of the exhibition is a moving sidewalk. It was powered by electric motors and was divided into 2 parts. On one half you could stand. The other part of the sidewalk was equipped with seats.
Then, similar sidewalks were presented at the Paris exhibition in 1900. But these are all technical novelties. It's not the most surprising thing about this exhibition.
The most surprising is the speed of construction of the exhibition on the swamp and the design of buildings. Let's look at the most interesting buildings.
Because they just built some ancient city with all the statues and studs. All these buildings were built in less than 3 years. It was necessary to create project documentation and calculate everything. I think to only create a project of one such building will take more than a year.
And here we see architectural masterpieces created on the swamp.
You look at this photo and it is difficult to determine what this place is. It may be Rome or Venice, but it is simply impossible to imagine that this is Chicago.
In this photo, it's like some shot from a utopia movie, American flag somewhere in Florence. And this is just Venice waterfront. I can probably show you antique buildings in Chicago for another hour, but let's save your time. I will leave all the links under the video who wants to then read it himself. Just show you this pavilion, I was interested in its empty armor. And these are either birds or dragons. As we can see, built just an ancient city on the swamps.
Less than 3 years have passed from the project to the first visitors.
Somehow everything is fantastically quickly built. Some bloggers have an opinion that these are old buildings. They were not built anew but simply restored for the exhibition. Yes, the version that these buildings have already stood since ancient times seems very reasonable. There was an ancient city. It was tinted, clean fountains and opened for an exhibition.
Very attractive version. I myself at first adhered to it, but the more you look, the more you find. I also found
there are a lot of photos of the construction of the Chicago exhibition. I will now show you them. Here, you can see that there is a decoration and construction of pavilions.
But if you look at this photo, it is not clear what is happening. A new hangar is being built on the left.
And on the right, there is a really ancient building.
But another building also looks like restoration.
Here is also an intermediate stage, and it is not clear they are building or restoring. And here we see how statues were created. In this photo, stages of construction of transport building. Here's the continuation of building the transport building.
Here they create a statue of the Republic.
Photos of the construction of the exhibition are also many. The link will be under the video. You can carefully consider everything and draw conclusions for yourself. According to official history, all these palaces and fountains were built of wood and plaster. Now let's look at some interesting questions related to this world exhibition. First of all, this exhibition should be timed to coincide with the 400th anniversary of Columbus' discovery of America. It's supposed to be 1892, but the exhibit only opened in 1893. Maybe she was actually timed for another event. Another strange thing happened at this exhibition. It featured a Viking ship.
It was a copy of Leif Erikson's ship, the Norwegian navigator. About 1,000 years ago, he was the first European to discover the shores of the Americas.
When I read about the Viking ship at the Chicago exhibition, I was very surprised. I always believed that the history of the discovery of America by the Vikings really appeared only in the 20th century. And then at the largest exhibition of 1893, the Americans recognized that the Vikings first discovered the American continent. Let's find out where this Viking story even came from. In the winter of 1879, a sailor living in the port of Sandefjord devoted his free time to inspecting the kurgan on the outskirts of the city. According to legend, the Viking was buried with all his possessions. The inhabitants of Sandefjord believed little the legend about this kurgan, but the sailor insisted after he dug a square hole about 2 meters deep.
His shovel hit a hard oak board which turned out to be the side of the ship.
After that, the Royal University of Christiania, now it is the city of Oslo,
sent people to inspect the relic. And in early summer, when the frozen earth could be cleared, it turned out to be an ancient Viking ship.
The ship was repaired and taken to the university for storage.
For the upcoming World Columbian exhibition in Norway opened a fundraiser to build a copy of the found Viking ship.
In the spring of 1893, the ship was built, weighing 27 tons 72 feet long, 16 feet wide, and propelled by 32 oars. The ship went to New York in the beginning and in mid-July arrived in Chicago. A very strange story with this Viking ship. The Norwegians built a copy of the ship and completely calmly crossed the ocean.
And somehow strange, The exhibition is organized in honor of Columbus, but they for some reason invited the descendants of the Vikings as the discoverers of America.
And most interesting, from what documents did the Norwegians take this story about Eliaf Eriksson?
I had never heard this story about the Viking ship before, and I was really surprised that at the end of the 19th century, the Norwegians and Americans really believed that the Vikings discovered America.
The exhibition worked for 6 months and closed October 30th, 1893.
It was the greatest exhibition in history. It was visited by 27 million people.
People at the exhibition admired new technologies such as electric railway, artificial lightning, and also listened to music transmitted live by phone from New York.
Broadcast live by phone from New York. For 2.5 years on the swamps built a huge exhibition center with fountains, channels, lakes. Almost all the buildings at the exhibition were built using frame technology.
In the beginning, they put a frame of wood or metal, and then it was all finished with panels of gypsum and jute fibers. These are all beautiful buildings were built as temporary ones that needed to be demolished in 6 months. Despite the fact that the exhibition brought profit, after closing it was practically abandoned.
Imagine, built such beauty and 6 months later closed and left to collapse.
The fair ended in October 1893. By June 1894, all exhibits were removed from the buildings of the White City.
Those grand buildings were empty. They looked like they were made of marble.
But actually, they were made of wood, metal frames, covered in a material called staff, a mixture of gypsum and hemp.
On July 5, 1894, at PM, a small fire broke out in the first edition. By the time the fire department arrived at the scene, the fire had already spread to the next edition. The fire spread rapidly throughout the exhibition. Burning roofs of buildings began to collapse.
It only took 2 hours for the whole city to turn into rubble. Some historians believe that the likely cause of the fire was the presence of squatters in the buildings.
Homeless refugees due to the financial panic of 1893. Homeless people cooked food and basked at the bonfires which were bred in the exhibition buildings. But there's another version, it was purposeful arson. So who could set the exhibition on fire?
Turns out in 1884, there were arsons all over Chicago.
For example, about 700 railway carriages burned down at the South Chicago Railway Station. To understand the cause of the arson, we need to meet Mr. Pullman. Here's an interesting late 19th century saying. We were born in Pullman House, fed from Pullman shops, taught at Pullman School, catechized in Pullman's church, and when we die, we go to Pullman's hell.
Industrialist George Pullman was born March 3, 1831 in New York. When Pullman, a high school dropout, arrived in Chicago at the age of 14, he had an idea: solve the problem of knee-deep dirt that plagued the streets of the city. And by the age of 16, he and several of his partners had started making money building new foundations under houses.
Something strange was going on in America at the end of the 19th century. All the cities were drowned in mud.
Even Pullman started his business, as I understood it, on new foundations.
Pullman used his share of the income to design and build a comfortable railroad sleeping car.
Pullman was able to arrange for the body of murdered President Abraham Lincoln to be transported from Washington to Springfield in Pullman's carriage.
After that, he received a huge number of orders for sleeping cars.
In general, in our understanding, Pullman becomes a billionaire.
All this happened at a time when robbers like Rockefeller and Andrew Carnegie began a meteoric career as corporate capitalists.
Pullman watched as many corporations
began to experience problems with workplace unrest and strikes due to low wages and appalling working conditions.
Pullman decided to create a system that minimizes such problems for his business.
Presenting himself as a welfare capitalist, Pullman wanted to inspire workers by paying high wages.
In the south side of Chicago, he built a model factory town with beautiful Victorian houses, which were equipped with internal plumbing, natural gas.
But all the real estate belonged to the Pullman Company.
At a time when most factory cities in the United States were a collection of dilapidated shacks, Pullman City seemed like an enlightened achievement.
Here's a look at those workers' houses. And this building housed a library, theatre, bank, and more.
But the church in the town of Pullman, but here it is some low basement windows, as if the church is covered. Public buildings planned by Pullman included a school offering free education up to grade 8. Stable, market where meat and vegetables were sold, casino, Hotel Florence, and a 2-story arcade, which housed a library, theatre, bank, offices, and confectionery halls with steam heating. Pullman built a greenstone church and shelter, as well as a forest warehouse, a dairy farm,
with 100 cows to provide the residents with milk, cream, and butter.
Gas lights lit the street. 2 parks were created, a lagoon with a waterfall,
Sports Island for sports. About 12,000 people lived in Pullman town. Yes, here you read just some socialism built Pullman, parks, dairy farms. Only under socialism there was no casino in Pullman, and the casino built. When signing their home leases, workers had to agree to the rules, which included everything from caring for lamps and stoves to curfews, dress codes, as well as personal purity and behavior, and especially drunkenness. But Pullman wasn't an altruist. He built a library, but it only had paid access.
It seemed that he sincerely believes that all religions are the same, and that's why everyone should unite and go water church. When the residents disagreed with his idea of one world religion, he offered to rent the church to that group of believers who wanted, but the rent for the church was very high, and none of the religious groups could afford it, so the church stood empty. The streets of the city were kept clean, and all premises were repaired. The payment for all this was deducted from the wages of the workers.
The city of Pullman was described as a city of European serfdom.
In general, after all the payments for rent and utilities, Pullman's workers had practically no money left. Then there was the financial crisis of 1893. Orders for Pullman wagons fell,
and management started a program of layoffs and wage cuts.
But the wages of workers before the crisis was equal to the subsistence minimum, and after a reduction of 25%, people began to simply survive. The situation was even more desperate for workers living in the town of Pullman, because the company refused to lower rents even though in other Chicago neighborhoods homeowners were lowering rents. Pullman workers went on strike out of desperation. They were supported by the American Railway Union.
125,000 people left their jobs in for days on 29 railways.
President Cleveland sent 12,000 troops to suppress a strike in Chicago. The news angered Pullman's workers, and they burned 700 cars at Chicago stations. They also set fire to an empty exhibition center. The strike was suppressed by the troops. 30 workers were killed.
Workers were forced to return to their jobs.
Pullman died of a heart attack October 19, 1897, aged 66. The funeral cortege arrived at Graceland Cemetery, where a hole the size of a middle room was dug. Its base and walls were made of reinforced concrete 17 inches thick. The walls were made of reinforced concrete 8 inches thick. Pullman's body was lowered into the pit in a lead coffin. The coffin was covered with a tarp, then the pit was filled with concrete. Then laid the steel rails at right angles to each other and bolted them together. Then the rails were poured with a layer of concrete. All these precautions are taken to prevent desecration of the body. This is how the workers' friend and benefactor George Pullman ended his life. Back to the fire at the World Expo. It wasn't the only sad event of the Columbian Expo. In the midsummer of 1893, a smallpox epidemic broke out at the fair and spread throughout the city. Shortly before the closing ceremony of the exhibition, Chicago Mayor Carter Harrison was shot dead. Imagine, it's 1893. The grandest world exhibition is being built. This means that the US economy was fine at the time, and the country can afford such huge spending. But interestingly, it was in 1893 that one of the biggest financial crises in the United States began. The first clear signs of the financial crisis appeared February 20, 1893. In short, for objective reasons, there was a financial panic. Who will be interested? The link will be in the description. People rushed to withdraw their money from banks and caused their bankruptcy. Financial panic in London combined with the fall of continental European trade forced foreign investors to sell US stocks to get US gold-backed funds. In the United States, about 15,000 companies and 500 banks went bankrupt. 17 to 19% of Americans lost their jobs. People could not pay their mortgages and therefore lost their homes. The unemployment rate in New York reached 35%. Free kitchens were opened to help the poor. In many cities of the country, people were willing to work only for food. And then came the spring of 1893. In the United States, the strongest financial crisis. People were left without their homes and jobs. And then we have the World Exhibition in Chicago. It was visited by 27 million people. So who are these people who came to the exhibition? And after all, this is almost half the population of the United States. How can this be? Crisis, unemployment, armed suppression of strikes. And the exhibition was attended by 27 million people. Who are these people is very strange. We will return to this issue. So let's now move on again to these beautiful buildings that were built in 2 years of plaster, wood and iron. Historians seem to explain everything logically. Everything was made on prefabricated structures from wood made of iron. Then they were decorated with plaster stucco, so they managed to build everything in 2 years. And then this beauty was accidental, or not accidentally. But not all buildings were built of wood and plaster, and not all buildings burned down. For example, the German pavilion, for some reason it was built of some other materials, and was not damaged in the fire of 1894. The German pavilion stood until March 31, 1925. On this day it burned in a fire. The Palace of Fine Arts is also for some reason built not of wood and plaster, but of brick, and this building for some reason bypassed the fire. It now houses the Museum of Science and Industry. If you look at this building now, that full sense of antediluvian architecture. As we see at the temporary exhibition, at least 2 buildings were built of brick, so maybe there were more of them. Maybe really on this site there was some preserved area of the antediluvian world. Yes, I agree that most of the exhibition pavilions were built in 1882, but in this place, there were also ancient buildings of a purely modern civilization. Under the video, look at the links and decide for yourself built-in exhibition from scratch or partially used old buildings. Let's distract from global issues and look at one exhibition promotional poster. Look at the top right corner.
Here, tell me what hussars do in Chicago.
On YouTube full of videos with engravings of that time, where people in similar uniforms clean up the R's. Hussars similar to 19th century international gendarmes, people who suppressed riots across the planet. After studying the history of the United States of the 19th century, I am tormented by the question of where in America such huge financial and construction resources come from.
To hold such exhibitions, it does not even matter here whether they used antediluvian buildings or built from scratch.
The question is to fill the exhibitions themselves. Take the Ferris wheel. This is a giant structure that was designed and built into years.
Or electric railway. It also looks almost like a modern.
Where in America such an opportunity to turn a swamp into cities? Here to take Central Park in New York, there too, with the help of gunpowder and carts, leveled a huge area. In other cities of America, hills are easily cut and completely change the landscape. I do not believe that the American government could do this. The huge city of San Francisco was raised from ruins in 6 years.
Today, with all the financial power of America, New Orleans has not yet been fully restored.
The more you study the history of America, the more facts that in America there was some huge experiment in the settlement of territory and the management of people. Take care of yourself and subscribe to the channel.